then that motion should have come forward. If I could ask for, nothing has changed in terms of the intention of the motion and in terms of making sure that we're following the procedures here of the House.
That's not how the process works. The House gave
I thank the honourable member for Regina Capel for his understanding of this matter. When shall this bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House.
Well done.
Statements by members. Déclaration de député. L'honorable député, the honourable member from Brampton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the official opposition recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself. I was terrified and instantly prayed to God, hoping that no Muslim was involved in this incident. Jumping to such baseless and emotive language without verification and spreading misinformation demonstrates a serious lack of judgment, especially at a time when the conflict in the Middle East has led to an increase in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. The leader of the Conservative... Shame!
Nobody even knows your name.
Colleagues, there is one... Colleagues, I invite you all to listen to your whips. There is one person who has the floor at this time for the purposes of having the statement of the order. I'm going to ask the honourable member to start again from his statement from the top. The honourable member from Brampton Centre.
Speaker, last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the Conservative Party recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself. I was terrified and instantly prayed to God, hoping that no Muslim was involved in this incident. Jumping to such baseless and emotive language without verification and spreading
The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton, and the honourable member from Fort Saskatchewan, Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, I will ask, please, to restrain themselves so that the chair can listen to the statement. I'm having trouble listening to the statement. I'll also ask the member from South Shore St. Margaret's to please to respect the chair. Thank you. The honourable member from Brampton Centre, from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the official opposition recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself.
I have asked members to exercise restraint now 3 times. The honourable member from Brampton Centre, from the top, without interruption, please.
Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the official opposition recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself. I was terrified and instantly prayed to God, hoping that no Muslim was involved in this incident. Jumping to such baseless and emotive language without verification and spreading
It's his maiden speed.
Such a bully, Andrew.
No. So I know that members would not do value the opportunity that they have to make statements, which are very important for them, for their constituents. We are now running behind because this is the fourth time I've taken and the last time I'm going to raise my stand on my feet on this issue before I start cutting statements from today's list that has been provided to me. So I will ask all members to please keep themselves under control so that we can get all statements that were planned to be given today. The honourable member from Brampton Centre, from the top.
Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the official opposition recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself. I was terrified and instantly prayed to God, hoping that no Muslim was involved in this incident. Jumping to such baseless and emotive language without verification and spreading misinformation demonstrate a serious lack of judgment, especially at a time when the conflict in the Middle East had led to an increase in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism here at home. The leader of the Conservative Party tries to politicize every issue for political gain by spreading fear.
Since there are no points of order at this time, I would invite the Honourable Whip to come. I would invite the Honourable Whip to approach the chair, please, while we move on to the next statement. From the member of Humble River, Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Recent incidents targeting our Jewish and Muslim communities concern all of us deeply. Many Canadians, including my colleagues in the House, are being targeted based on their religious or cultural backgrounds, and this is unacceptable to everyone. Let us stand together as a testament that Canadians value each other as colleagues and as fellow citizens, and that it is paramount to support the right of each other's communities to enjoy peace and security in Canada. Canada has always been a country where peace, tolerance, mutual understanding and kindness are of utmost importance. Prejudice and hatred have no place in our nation. We must rise above division, extending compassion and support to all. Canadians made their kindness a worldwide brand, and there is no better branding for us than this. Let's be grateful for what we have and unite around peace and tranquility in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, we know that buying local is fundamental, but the Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, we know that buying local is fundamental, but to benefit from local products and services, we need entrepreneurs with strong regional and national roots. And the Acton region has understood this marvelously well. The Acton business community owes a lot to Joanne Jeanette, who led the Chamber of Commerce for 22 years. Under Joanne's leadership, the Chamber enjoyed a new lease on life, moving its offices from the emblematic Gare d'Acton, developing tourism in the region, hiring young people during the summer season, taking charge of the Acton Agri-Food Fair, and setting up the Gala Distinction. Since last year, Joanne has passed the management torch to Cassandra Levesque while continuing to work at the Chamber 2 days a week. Although she will be leaving at the end of the day, and right now is spending her last hours there, we know that she is watching us, and we can say that with certainty the region is not leaving her, and she is now a city councillor for the town of Acton Val. Thank you very much, Joanne. The Honourable Member for Bourassa. Mr. Speaker, the Ouverture Youth Centre celebrated its 40th anniversary in Montreal North in the riding of Bourassa. Under the leadership of Director Sheila Fortuné, this organization plays an essential role in the academic and social success of young people. It's a place where young people can thrive, and it's their home. The organization has set up a variety of programs aimed at empowering young people, including the annual street basketball tournament, which enables young people to shine in the prestigious NBA League. I am happy to mark this anniversary because I, too, Mr. Speaker, took advantage of the organization's services when I was younger, playing soccer and dancing when the late Félix Saint-Élien was the director. Congratulations to the member of the board, employees, and to the volunteers who help our young people succeed. Thank you.
The honourable member from Cypress Hills Grasslands, and I will speak privately to the member from Perth Wellington in just a moment, please. Honourable member from Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, Christmas is fast approaching. It's a special time of year for so many reasons. In every part of this great country, people are feeling excited and preparing for quality time and holiday cheer. Along with all the busy shopping, there's so much charity, goodwill, and solace that is inspired by the season. It happens all over the world. People of many different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds celebrate Christmas, even in predominantly Muslim countries like Indonesia, where my sister lives. Christmas brings peace and unity during difficult times, including war and economic depression. But every so often, there comes along a Scrooge or a Grinch who wants to steal Christmas. No. This time around, it's the Canadian Human Rights Commission saying, "Bah humbug." They released a new report suggesting that our public celebration of Christmas is somehow a form of religious intolerance and discrimination. It's just another ridiculous example of woke ideology after 8 years of this out-of-touch Liberal government.
That's right.
But no matter what they say, I will join the overwhelming majority of Canadians and celebrate Christmas wholeheartedly. Merry Christmas!
The honourable member from Oakville North, Burlington.
Mr. Speaker, November is Women Abuse Prevention Month, which recognizes the need to drive awareness and education surrounding abuse against women. 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of attending the From Wallet to Wealth Gala, which was organized by the amazing Whitney Hammond. The gala raised $70,000 for Halton Women's Place, which provides a 24-hour information and support line, outreach services, and emergency shelter services for those in need of a safe space. One of their new initiatives are Purple Benches, located in Oakville and Burlington, as part of the Barb's Bench project. The project began in Nova Scotia to honor Barbara Bailey and the victims of violence against women, and as a reminder that intimate partner violence still exists and is still a major threat to women everywhere. This month and every day, let's take action to end femicides and gender-based violence. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, this Monday marked a milestone for Richmond Hill and a significant leap forward in our fight against the housing crisis. I was pleased to join the Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities in announcing an agreement to fast-track over 780 housing units in Richmond Hill. This initiative is a catalyst for over 41,500 homes in the coming decade, fueled by $31 million investment from the Housing Accelerated Fund. This will address the long-standing barrier to housing construction and accelerate the creation of not only increased housing density, but also much-needed affordable unit across the community. I congratulate the municipality for their milestone, and I'm proud to witness our government's historic investment in our community that demonstrates what can be achieved with innovation, collaboration, and a steadfast resolve to address the housing needs of Canadians in Richmond Hill and across Canada. Together, we are forging a future of a strong, accessible, and thriving communities, affirming our commitment to affordability and prosperity for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from West Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to rise on this last day of Diabetes Awareness Month to recognize and thank the patients, advocates, researchers, and healthcare professionals in our communities who continue to work extremely hard to combat this chronic disease. As a Type 1 dad and co-chair of the All-Party Caucus on Juvenile Diabetes, this subject is very important to me, as I know the serious health impacts it has on patients living with the disease and their families. This year marks the 102nd anniversary of Canada's discovery of insulin, and while its discovery was a game changer for the millions of people living with the disease, there is still much more work to do. With more than 200,000 new cases diagnosed each year, diabetes is the most common chronic disease across our country. Mr. Speaker, as Diabetes Awareness Month comes to an end, I invite all of my colleagues to keep conversations around diabetes awareness going so that we can better support all those living with this chronic disease and one day find a cure to defeat it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Eglinton Lawrence.
Mr. Speaker, today we are marking the exclusion of more than 1 million Jewish peoples. This exclusion was motivated by persecutions and genocide.
Families found safe harbor in Canada, a significant number of whom put down roots in my riding of Eglinton Lawrence. Despite their exceptional contributions, Jews have continued to face a torrent of anti-Semitism. Tragically, the October 7 terrorist attack in Israel has exacerbated this hate. Jewish day schools have been shot at, synagogues firebombed, students swarmed on campuses, and businesses have been accosted. As Canadians, we should universally condemn these appalling incidents, and those responsible must be brought to justice by law enforcement. But we must also strengthen Holocaust remembrance and education. Today, B'nai B'rith is hosting a virtual commemoration of the story of Jews who were expelled from Arab countries and Iran. I encourage all to visit their website and learn, because it is only through learning, education, and respect that we can ultimately defeat anti-Semitism and hatred in all of its forms.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. After 8 years of inflationary spending, Canadians just can't afford this Prime Minister's costs. Today, we learned that Canada's GDP fell by 1.1% in the last quarter, a fifth consecutive decline, while that of our U.S. neighbours rose by 5.2%. It's really bad news for Canadians struggling to make ends meet. Waiting in food bank lines by the millions because this PM's inflationary policies have increased the cost of everything. Something can be done now to help Canadians. This Prime Minister can help bring down the price of food by taking immediate action. Let's call on Liberal senators to vote immediately in favour of Bill C-234 and to stop filibustering in the Senate. This week, the Liberals voted with the Bloc to keep the tax on farmers, making food more expensive for everyone. Instead of giving Canadians the help they need so desperately, the Liberals and their Bloc allies are working to make everything more expensive. It costs a lot to vote for the Bloc. Only the common sense Conservatives will restore hope by abolishing the tax on everything while we reduce the cost of food, gas and home heating for all Canadians.
The honourable member from Flamborough-Glanbrook.
Mr. Speaker, we were alarmed but not surprised this week to learn that food bank use in Ontario is at an all-time high. And we have seen a similar increase in my home community of Hamilton. But what's particularly concerning is that there's been an 82% increase in people with jobs that are relying on food banks. The erosion of the middle class under 8 years of this Liberal NDP government is another reason why this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. With Scotiabank confirming that 2% of rate hikes are attributable to reckless spending and deficits by these Liberals, mortgage renewals are the latest gut punch that are going to hit household budgets. And I heard this at a Diwali celebration this past weekend, and I heard this at the Christmas cattles the week before. Canadians are very, very concerned. But I want to say to Hamiltonians and Ontarians that the common sense Conservatives hear you and we're fighting for you. And under the leadership of the Honourable Member for Carleton, we're going to deliver powerful paychecks and restore the middle class dream for Canadians once again.
The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-La Petite Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tuesday night at the Bell Centre, we paid a moving tribute to Carl Tremblay, the soul of the Cowboys fringant, gone too soon, too young. In this iconic venue, we celebrated the indelible impact of his music on our lives. The engaging melodies, the poignant lyrics resonated in our hearts, reminding us of Carl's exceptional musical legacy. In front of a vibrant crowd, we shared memories and expressed our gratitude to this exceptional artist. Thank you, Carl, for your years of dedication to the Quebec scene. Your legacy will live on. On Tuesday night, the Bell Centre vibrated to the sound of your timeless passion. Your voice will live on forever. Farewell, Carl Tremblay.
The Honourable Member from Timmins, James Bay.
Thornlow Cheese Factory is a symbol of the resilience, skill, and determination of the Temiskaming Dairy region. The various blends of Asiago, Charlton Blue, and the incredible Devil's Rock cheese have won all kinds of awards. This is why people in the north were so shocked by the news that Gay Leaf Foods is closing the plant and walking away in the region. Well, not so fast. The people of Northern Ontario were determined to keep this value-added food processing operation, and the farmers have a winning track record. In 2006, Parmalat announced their decision to shut the plant, and rallies were held and a clear message was sent. Parmalat could leave, but the dairy quota stays. And that's the same message for Gay Lee. I worked with the Temiskaming Dairy Committee to save the plant in 2006, and I will be at their side to get Thornlow back up and running. And so when negotiations begin with a new buyer, it is essential that FedNor and the federal government is at the table to help with the necessary upgrades so that Thornlow continues to produce a world-class product. Our farmers have a simple message. They love the North, and they will fight for Thornlow.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Mr. Speaker, after Chamonix, Val-Gardena, and Courchevel, the Women's Giant Slalom World Cup ski circuit stops in Mont-Tremblant this weekend. The Women's Giant Slalom. What a proud moment for all Laurentides-Labelle, but also for Quebec. The International Ski Federation chose Mont-Tremblant because it's the #1 ski resort in eastern North America, according to several rankings. It's the know-how of an entire region that is being honored and celebrated. It's in this warm atmosphere that we'll be watching the top athletes take to the slopes, and the pedestrian village will be alive with entertainment and musical performances. I myself will have the honor of presenting an award on Saturday, and it's with great joy and happiness that I wish the athletes and organizers a fabulous World Cup 2023.
The Honourable Member from Desnete, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost.
That's right.
You know who agrees with that statement? The Chiefs of Ontario, who filed a judicial review today against this Liberal government's carbon tax. The Chiefs of Ontario are rightfully claiming that the Liberal carbon tax is leaving First Nations communities worse off and is intentionally designed ignoring their situations. This Liberal carbon tax disproportionately affects First Nations, and the Ontario Chiefs are asking why a carbon tax carve-out was only given to a region in Canada where the Prime Minister was tanking in the polls. Yet they are left to deal with the unfair burden this tax places on their communities as they struggle to heat their homes and feed their families. Remember, Mr. Speaker, it was this Prime Minister who claimed that the relationship with First Nations is the most important one to him and his government.
That's right.
But that clearly isn't true, as the Prime Minister is forcing First Nations to go to court to finally be heard in their demands to axe the carbon tax for the children, seniors, and families living in their communities.
Good point.
The honourable member from Brampton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday in this chamber, the leader of the official opposition recklessly labeled a car explosion in the U.S. near the Rainbow Bridge as a terrorist attack. The Conservative leader's characterization of the event shocked many Canadians, including myself. I was terrified and instantly prayed to God, hoping that no Muslim was involved in this incident. Jumping to such baseless and emotive language without verification and spreading misinformation demonstrate a serious lack of judgment, especially at a time when the conflict in the Middle East has led to an increase in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism here at home. The leader of the Conservative Party tries to politicize every issue by spreading fear and misleading Canadians. Canadians deserve better, Mr. Speaker. This leader is just not worth the risk.
The honourable member from Perth Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, as we embark on the Christmas season, we celebrate the spirit of giving that exists in communities across Perth Wellington. I'm always amazed by the generosity of so many people who give so freely of their time and talents in the service of others. This year marks the 35th anniversary of To Stratford with Love, a community dinner organized by the Conider family where 1,000 people may enter as strangers but leave as friends. In the town of Minto, David and Jean Anderson will once again host their annual Christmas Day dinner for all who wish to share a meal. And thank you to all those who are filling Christmas hampers, organizing toy drives, and raising funds so that others may have a merry and bright Christmas. Finally, in the spirit of giving, I encourage all who are able to donate blood this Christmas season. For those who are battling leukemia, like Kelly Byers, and countless others who need this gift of life, rolling up our sleeves is the least we can do and is a small action that can have a big impact. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well done, John.
The honourable member from Vancouver Granville.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's Walk of Fame is a national non-profit charitable organization that inspires Canadians by proudly shining a light on extraordinary Canadian achievers and their successes. This Saturday, Canada's Walk of Fame will celebrate a history-in-the-making 25th anniversary gala. As Parliamentary Secretary for the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, I look forward to attending this truly inclusive celebration of Canadian achievers, athletes, actors, legends, Olympians, musicians, filmmakers, storytellers, humanitarians, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, titans of science and innovation, and the next generation of heroes. From the Honourable Rosalie Abella to Avril Lavigne, from Cardinal Official to my friends Drew and Jonathan Scott, this event will highlight the incredible talent of Canadians from all walks of life and the incredibly inspirational role that they play every day. The event will inspire and unify us, Mr. Speaker, and remind us of the richness of talent that these remarkable Canadians from every corner of this great country share with us and the world every day. Thank you.
Oral questions. Questions orales. Gonna have Chef de
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After 8 years, Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has replaced the joy of Christmas for children with poverty. 27,000 young people in Quebec have had to ask for a Christmas present under the 29th edition of the Santa Claus operation. One letter says, I'd like to be able to get a gift so that we can eat well on Christmas Eve. This has never been seen before, according to the coordinator. Young people are looking for warm clothes like snowsuits. When will the Prime Minister reverse these inflationary deficits so that our kids can have the joy of Christmas back? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Side of the House, we will always invest in our economy and help vulnerable Canadians at the same time. That's why our Canada Child Benefit has lifted almost 500,000 children out of poverty, Mr. Speaker. That's why we put in place $10 a day childcare. Why, Mr. Speaker? So families can go back to work. And that's why we are stabilizing grocery prices with the law that we introduce in this House today, and we encourage every member of this House to vote in favor of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Environment Minister, the Liberal Environment Minister, is imposing a tax that punishes single moms, farmers, and small business. At the same time, he's been taking 60,000-kilometer flights in business class, obviously, and his climate change coordinator took flights to the equivalent of going around the globe 4 times, Mr. Speaker. When will the government stop the hypocrisy and the taxes? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians watching us will see where the hypocrisy is. The Conservative leader, Mr. Speaker, was against all the investments we've made in green energy, in green aluminum, in green steel, in battery plants. I've never heard the opposition leader speak out in favor of the Canadian economy, in favor of the energy transition, and in favor of Canadian workers. That's what we're doing on this side of the House. We're fighting for workers and the green economy.
After 8 years, we've entered the next phase of this Prime Minister's economic misery. We've seen just inflation, and today we learn Canada's in a state of stagflation, as our economy shrunk by 1.1% in the most recent quarter, while the American economy boomed at 5%. Wow. Mr. Speaker, this is the result of high taxes, big deficits, and crippling red tape. At the same time as the prices rise for Canadians, their wages are falling down. The economy is now smaller than it was on a per capita basis 5 years ago. Why is it that the American economy is roaring while this Prime Minister's economy is snoring?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, despite the trite rhymes coming from the other side of the House, I'd like to remind everybody in this House that we actually have an economic plan, unlike the opposition. Our GDP today, Mr. Speaker, is at 4.1% above pre-pandemic levels. That is higher than Italy, the European Union, France, and Germany, Mr. Speaker, and the IMF projects that Canada will have the highest economic growth in the G7 in 2024. Mr. Speaker, that's an economic plan at work.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the economy is smaller today than it was 5 years ago on a per capita basis, and the IMF projects Canada will have the worst economic growth over the next 6 years and the next 40 years. This is the result of high tax hypocrisy. The Environment Minister, it now comes out after he punishes single moms and small business owners and farmers for heating their homes and driving their vehicles. He has flown 60,000 kilometers. His climate change chair has flown the equivalent of going around the world 4 times, and now they're off with 70,000 other people at a air-conditioned dome in the desert in a petro state, Mr. Speaker. Why won't they park the jet, end the hypocrisy, and axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, there is one number that the Conservative leader will not talk about, Mr. Speaker, is that Canada ranked 3rd in the world for foreign direct investment. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, just yesterday, Dow Chemical announced one of its largest investment in 126 years in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be thousands of jobs, hundreds of thousands of hours of construction, Mr. Speaker. This is how you lead the economy. This is how you lead a country. This is how you lead to bring investment in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I think he wants to lead the party, Mr. Speaker. while his prime minister leads the economy into a ditch. The high tax hypocrisy knows no bounds. Now First Nations are speaking up. First it was revolting Liberal MPs who were worried about losing their seats because of the prime minister's tax on home heat. Then it was other premiers refusing to collect the tax. Then it was farmers fighting for their ability to produce food without taxes. And now First Nations, over 100 First Nations communities have taken this government to court because they're violating the rights of our First People with the carbon tax on rural and remote people. When will they stop violating the constitutional rights of First Nations and axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, they're not our First People, but they are First Nations, which are independent First Nations. And, Mr. Speaker, this government from no, they're not. Listen to that, Mr. Speaker. The colonialism in this place from the Conservatives just won't quit. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that we respect First Nations on this side. We know that they're leaders. That's why we've invested hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in First Nations to ensure equity in water, in child welfare, and in housing, and we'll continue, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de La Prairie.
The honourable member for La Prairie.
Will the honourable member from Battle Creek Crowfoot please wait his turn to ask a question? The honourable
member for La Prairie.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, Quebec alone gets as many asylum seekers as all the other provinces combined. This has cost Quebecers $460 million, even though refugee claims are a federal responsibility. Quebecers shouldn't have to foot the bill for Canadians, nor do they deserve the arrogance of an immigration minister, even though he's from Quebec, who tells them he's not a bank machine. It's a shame to have to go over a Quebec minister's head to solve a problem for Quebecers, but that's what we have to do. We have no choice. So I call on the Minister of Finance. Will she reimburse Quebecers?
The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, clearly there's a global refugee crisis. Canada is affected by it too. We have a moral duty to do something. Asylum seekers are a shared jurisdiction between Quebec and Canada, and we will continue to have discussions with Quebec City. The honourable member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, it took a minister from New Brunswick to finally get the federal government to acknowledge Quebecers' generosity toward refugee claimants. On Tuesday, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs acknowledged that Quebec's public services and community organizations were overwhelmed. At least he acknowledged it. That's a start. Meanwhile, Quebecers have had to pay $460 million, even though it's a federal responsibility. On Tuesday, the minister undertook to speak to his colleague, the finance minister. Has he done that? And when will they send a check to Quebec for $460 million? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad my colleague has acknowledged the work done by my colleague and friend, the Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. There have been very constructive talks between the immigration minister and his counterpart in Quebec City. I've had a number of meetings with other members of Mr. Legault's cabinet. These are solid ties. The Bloc is trying to suggest that there's a squabble, but the only fight here is one that the Bloc is trying to pick, but there is no such fight because we're working together well.
Burnaby Sud.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
The U.S. officially charged an Indian government employee with attempting to assassinate a member of the Sikh community in New York. The target was on the very same list as Sikh Canadian Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was murdered in Surrey. These new allegations make Sikh Canadians feel even more unsafe. Meanwhile, the Conservative leader is siding with the Modi government and blaming Canada. What is the government doing to ensure the safety of Sikh Canadians amid these serious allegations?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the NDP for that important question. Obviously, the RCMP, with their policing partners across the country, are very engaged. with the Sikh community and other communities across the country that understandably feel an increased threat level with respect to what the U.S. Justice Department filed in a court in the United States yesterday. It is obviously a source of concern that's understandable in the Sikh community. The RCMP are continuing to collaborate with American law enforcement partners and will do everything necessary to ensure the safety of Canadians.
Hear, hear.
L'honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. We learned with great sadness that children in Quebec are asking Santa Claus for warm clothes and food. Operation Santa Claus has seen an increase in the number of these requests. 2,000 more requests have been made over year. How is the government going to deal with this crisis? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are here on this side of the House continuing to build an economy that works for all. That's why we introduced a bill here in the House today to build the economy for children, for seniors, for small business, and for grocery prices. That's our plan, Mr. Speaker, and I would encourage everyone in this place to vote in favor of it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
In an interview with CFRA's Bill Carroll, Dr. Barry Dworkin reported the case of a United Kingdom doctor who came to Canada fully qualified and ready to practice, but denied the ability to take a work permit simply because she was self-employed, an obvious paperwork snafu. She joins the 20,000 immigrants to Canada who are doctors that can't work, 32,000 nurses. Why won't the government take my common sense plan to bring in a blue seal professional standard that will allow immigrant doctors, nurses, and other professionals to quickly prove they are qualified, get to work earning powerful paychecks, serving patients in need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member across for the good question. We are working in partnership with the Ontario government to help reestablish all the foreign doctors, making sure that they can get accredited. Thank you so much for the question.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
8 years of this Liberal NDP government, they're not worth the cost. While the U.S. economy is booming with a growth of 5.2%, Canada's economy is shrinking. Canada will have the worst GDP per capita growth in all developed nations. In fact, U.S. GDP per person will be $80,000. Canada's only $50,000. Never has a government spent and taxed so much on Canadians with so little to show. Will the Finance Minister stand up today and tell Canadians why she's taking more from them and making them poorer?
Yeah. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives continue to talk down the economy, allow me to add in a few more facts into this House. We have ensured that 1.1 million additional jobs are available to Canadians since the end of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. And that's important because those are well-paying jobs. Mr. Speaker, wages have actually increased and outpaced inflation in this country. And the report that the Conservative colleague cites, Mr. Speaker, indicates that there was a significant upwards revision of Canada's growth in the second quarter in this country, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years as NDP Liberal government, the financial gap between Americans and Canadians has never been larger. The average GDP per capita in the United States is over $80,000. In Canada, it's merely $50,000. Unbelievably, Mr. Speaker, the situation is getting worse. The growth was over 5% in the United States this year. In Canada, it's shrinking by more than 1%. When will this government finally take responsibility for failing Canadians and change direction and adopt a common sense plan led by a common sense leader?
Once again, encourage all members, especially the member from Timmins James Bay, to wait his turn to ask a question. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member because he gives me the opportunity to talk about an American investment that just happened yesterday, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the Chemical made one of the largest investment in 126 years of history, Mr. Speaker. They're going to invest more than $10 billion in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Mr. Speaker, to do the first net zero ethylene plant in the world, Mr. Speaker. We're going to be producing green plastics. We're going to create jobs. We're going to grow the economy. That's a plan for the future, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to put it in place, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you very much. The reality is the more this government spends, the poorer Canadians get. Over the last 8 years, this government has imposed a record tax burden on Canadians, levels of debt and deficits never seen before in this country, and the result is the worst per capita growth rate since the Great Depression. Record food bank usage, 2 million Canadians going to food bank every month. Why are these Liberals so hell-bent to bankrupt Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our job as a government has been to balance compassion with fiscal responsibility, and that's exactly what we've done. We are there for Canadians with the Canada Child Benefit. We are there for families with supports. We're there for our seniors with supports, Mr. Speaker. And when the member opposite talks about being there for Canadians, I wonder why that very member has been filibustering our motion on the Canada Pension Plan in Finance Committee for weeks now, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to be there for Canadians.
The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we learned the U.S. economy grew by 5%, while in Canada our economy shrank by 1.1%. The American economy is booming and Canada's is stalled. Americans are getting richer, Canadians are getting poorer. Given these figures, will the government admit their economic plan is a failure? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commend my colleague's courage in asking a question in French. It's not easy for a francophone in the Conservative caucus, and even though I disagree with him, all Liberals here will stand up for his right to speak French. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, to answer clearly in French, a comment like that, I'd like to point out that my colleague apologized at committee. Can I continue, Mr. Speaker? Okay. My question is, Operation Santa Claus has been around since 1995 in Quebec. Young people are sending letters to Santa Claus. Normally they ask for toys, but this year they're asking for warm boots and snowsuits. Does this make any sense for this to be the situation we're in? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, there are two official languages here, English and French. Both can be used. I would ask members to please stay quiet and calm while a person answers a question. The Honourable Minister of Transport. From the top. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, French needs to be respected in this place. Both official languages should be respected in this place. And if a colleague answers in their mother tongue, that should be respected, whether it's English or French. Once again, I commend the courage of my colleague. It must not be easy being a Francophone Conservative, given the tyranny of their colleagues. We will always stand up for the right to speak in French. The Honourable Member for Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, COP28 kicks off today, and already the Liberals have had time to make another cowardly decision on climate change. Yesterday, Canada announced it would not allow the final declaration to state that we will one day have to move away from fossil fuels. The COP hadn't even started yet, and already Canada was fighting alongside the other petromonarchies to pollute more and more. To quote Greenpeace, the government is seriously slowing down the global fight against climate change. Mr. Speaker, why are the Liberals sabotaging the world's efforts to fight climate change? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP28 is the next major step in the collective effort to strengthen public safety, economic prosperity, and the well-being of our planet. We recognize that there are still challenges to be met. Canada is willing to work with its partners to accelerate global efforts in order to reach the main goal of the Paris Agreement, and that is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Bad news for the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. Their carbon capture strategy, the one they've been hiding behind at COP28, was panned by the OECD last week. A report from the International Energy Agency warns that it's a mistake to rely too heavily on carbon capture. The IEA warns that we need to start letting go of the illusion we will capture implausibly large amounts of CO2. It insists there's no alternative to switching to clean energy. When will the Liberals finally understand that their carbon capture strategy they're talking about in Dubai is nothing but a mirage? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc acknowledges that the federal and provincial governments have an important role to play in this issue of fighting climate change. It's ironic that the Bloc is calling for the cancellation of projects when they're constantly telling the federal government to mind its own business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, history is repeating itself at COP28. Canada is once again conjuring up a mirage of green oil. And while the Minister of the Environment is making fine speeches in Dubai, back home in Canada, oil company Suncor announced on Monday it was increasing production with the resumption of operations at the Terra Nova oil field in Newfoundland. Once again, while the minister is making fine speeches, oil is flowing like never before back here in Canada, all while the planet is burning. When will the Liberals stop being part of the climate problem? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my friend and colleague in the Bloc. The oil and gas industries make significant contributions to Canada's economy. They are also the largest emitters of GHG emissions. And that's why the oil patch is a key part of our plan to reduce emissions. This government plans to publish a plan for caps by the end of this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And not in Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, after enduring 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, 1 in 5 households in Ontario are struggling to put food on their tables. That adds up to 2.8 million people, including 700,000 children. This is shocking. This is the highest record numbers that we've ever seen. It's painfully clear that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-234 and to pass the bill now to bring lower prices for food for all Canadians?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we introduced legislation in this House today which seeks to modernize competition laws to stabilize grocery prices, and we encourage everyone in this chamber to vote in favor, including the member opposite. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I wonder why the party opposite continually votes against measures that aim to make life more affordable for Canadians, whether it is the Canada Child Benefit, whether it is $10 a day childcare, whether it is supports for small businesses. Every single time the party opposite votes against, and it's really difficult to understand what is their plan.
The honourable member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, under this government, there's been more people using a food bank than ever before. It's record numbers, and this Prime Minister is responsible for bringing record-level hunger to Ontario. Now, I understand that the self-proclaimed Socialist Environment Minister has threatened to resign if the bill passes, but Canadian farmers need this carve-out immediately. This will make food prices cheaper because if you're taxing farmers who grow the food, you're taxing Canadians who buy the food. So again, will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-234 and pass the bill so we can bring home lower prices for groceries for all Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just start by reminding the members opposite that the Senate is independent, and the only senators that sit in a caucus sit in that Conservative caucus. And I'd add, Mr. Speaker, that farmers understand the importance of fighting climate change and reducing emissions, and I'd thank that farmer for running her last election campaign on pricing carbon. That's why our pollution pricing policy reflects the realities of Canada's agriculture industry. We've spent almost $500 million on R&D and adoption for clean technologies for grain drying. We spent $12 million to reduce methane emissions from cattle, and we've spent $670 million to support the adoption of greenhouse gas reduction practices on farms, and we'll keep supporting farmers because they're key to fighting climate change.
It's usually Wednesdays that people are quite hopped up. It's a little surprising that it's happening today on a Thursday. I ask all members, please, allow the person who has the floor to speak so that we can hear the question and hear the answer. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, the costly Bloc Liberal coalition showed us once again yesterday they aren't worth the cost. They rejected our motion to force the Senate to pass our common sense bill C-234. After 8 years, when Canadians have never been in such dire straits, these two parties want to increase the carbon tax even more radically. Canadian farmers need our support. Will the Prime Minister tell his own appointed senators to stop blocking Bill C-234 and bring down the cost of groceries for all Canadians? The Honourable Government House Leader. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to reassure my honourable colleague, there are no Liberal senators. There are only Conservative senators. And it's Conservative senators who were bullying independent senators because they couldn't exercise their democratic right. The Conservative senators weren't respecting democracy. They weren't respecting Parliament. But the Senate is at an arm's length. It's independent, and they will act independently.
Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister acknowledged missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as an ongoing genocide. Parliament unanimously recognized it as a nationwide emergency. But how many times does the government's fall economic statement mention MMIWG2S? Zero, Mr. Speaker, zero. This government has a million excuses, but they refuse to take the urgent action that's needed to stop the violence. Can the minister explain why his government's fall economic statement fails to mention this ongoing genocide?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her comments and for her question. Addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ plus people is a whole of government approach which requires living up to our moral obligations as a country and to the calls for justice, Mr. Speaker. That's why Budget 2023 invests $125 million to implement the National Action Plan on MMWG, and we will continue to work with our partner, my friend opposite, as well as all Canadians to ensure that we address the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Thank you.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
There are First Nations who cannot return to their home communities due to the lack of homes. They are being pushed out of their culture, family, and traditions due to the neglect from the Liberals. At the pace this government is moving, it would take anywhere between 58 to 141 years to close the infrastructure gap, despite promising that they would close it by 2030. Can this government tell us when enough homes will be built for First Nations to be able to live in their home communities?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I share the member opposite's sense of urgency for closing the infrastructure in First Nations. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, in 2015, we inherited a situation where no investments had been made in housing, and since 2016, 30,000 homes or renovations have been completed across the nations with the leadership of First Nations, investing in new models, ensuring that people have the tools and the support and the equity to be able to continue to close that gap. We'll be there, Mr. Speaker, as a truthful partner with First Nations.
The honourable member from St. John's East.
Every day, approximately 12 people die by suicide in Canada. Each life lost by suicide can have far-reaching effects, whether that's families grappling with the loss of a loved one or the effects that are felt in communities. It's essential for Canadians to have timely access to suicide prevention. They need to know that they are not alone, that there is someone there to help. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions update us on the launch of 988 Suicide Prevention and Emotion Distress Crisis Line?
Great question. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from St. John's East, who is a strong advocate on mental health and many other issues. Our hearts go out to all loved ones of those who have lost someone to suicide, and for those, we also reach out to those who struggle with suicidal thoughts. Each life lost shatters an entire family, communities, and so much more. As of today, the people in Newfoundland and Labrador and anywhere in Canada can now call or text 988 to have access to 24/7 bilingual, trauma-informed, and culturally appropriate suicide prevention support. If you are thinking about suicide or worried about someone else thinking about suicide, call or text 988. You are not alone. There is help available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. People see it on their grocery bills, and farmers who grow the food see it while paying for their fuel. A young producer showed me his propane bill for grain drying from the start of harvest. In a span of 12 days, just 12 days, it cost him $950 in carbon tax alone, and harvest was just getting going. He's still waiting to see the final bill from drying his crops. Will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-2, 3, 4, and axe the tax for the farmers who grow our food?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. In fact, I know he's a very influential member of his caucus, Mr. Speaker, and people watching would know that. Mr. Speaker, if he wants to give a gift to Canadians before Christmas, why don't he convince his caucus colleagues to vote for affordability bill, Mr. Speaker, because in that bill, Canadians know that we will be reforming competition, one of the most fundamental reform in Canadian history, Mr. Speaker. We're going to have more power to the Contribution Bureau. We're going to make sure that they can do the study, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, Canadians know that the best way to stabilize price in the country for the mid to long term is to have more competition. Will they do the right thing for Canadians once for all?
Let's see. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, the fastest way to provide more affordability for Canadians would be to pass Bill C-234. Mr. Speaker, we have the receipts to show just how much the carbon tax costs farmers who grow the food. The natural gas bills for different months from a Saskatchewan farmer show that 1 month without grain drying is $135 a month, but 1 month with grain drying, $6,400. Wow. That's why the House passed Bill C-234 to give farmers tax relief. Who does the Prime Minister think should pay that ridiculous cost? The farmer who grows the food, or the families who are struggling to put food on the table for their kids?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 2 points. First of all, the only senators that are managed by anyone in this chamber are Conservative senators who sit in the caucus of the Leader of the Opposition. Second point is that if the members opposite were so concerned about food affordability, I would urge them to take a look across the pond at the instability that Vladimir Putin's illegal war is causing to food and supply chains around the planet. Ukraine is traditionally known as the breadbasket of the planet. Food supply issues and the cost of food is directly related to that illegal war. It would be great if the members opposite got behind supports like the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement.
The honourable member from Tobique-Matiquac.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals voted with the Bloc to keep the tax on farmers. This bill would have saved farmers nearly $1 billion between now and 2030. This Christmas season, people are hurting. PEI farmers are paying between $30,000 and $75,000 more a year due to the carbon tax, and a farmer in western New Brunswick has had his costs increased by over 30% on freight alone. This is unbearable for our producers and consumers. When will this Prime Minister finally hear the cries of our farmers and tell his senators to pass Bill 234?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the opposition Conservative Party does not have a plan for the environment. Quite simply, on Prince Edward Island, they're well aware of what the environment can do. With Fiona, we had winds of over 200 kilometers an hour. We destroyed burns. It killed dairy cattle. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, if you do not deal with the climate, you do not do anything with grocery prices. Our government has a plan for the environment, and we will lower and stabilize the grocery prices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Moose Jaw Lake Centre.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, everyone is struggling. Farmers across Canada buy their goods retail and sell what they produce wholesale. Farmers are now paying $150,000 in the inflationary carbon tax. They know this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. When will he tell his appointed senators to stop delaying C-234 and axe the tax so people can afford their groceries?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, again, I tell my honourable colleague what his party and his leader needs is a plan for the environment. We have a plan for the environment, and in fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was able to make an announcement in Manitoba with the government in order to create the last living lab right across this country. And in fact, what goes on with living labs is that scientists, farmers, and the industry.
I'm going to ask again, I've asked a couple of times for these colleagues, please keep your voices down when you don't have the floor. It's time for the minister to answer so that we can all hear the answer. I ask the member from Brantford-Brant, please to do so, and South Shore, St. Margaret's as well, to keep his voice down. The Honourable Minister from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated quite clearly, if you're going to deal with the environment, you have to have a plan for the environment. We have a plan for the environment, and I was just using one of many examples that we have. Living labs right across this country. What we do with living labs is make sure that farmers, scientists, and the industry itself works together in order to make sure we deal with climate change. We produce better crops. We take carbon out of the air and into the soil. We will continue to work with farmers and ranchers right across this country in order to make sure we stabilize food prices right across this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly unanimously criticized Ottawa's decision to give the contract for surveillance aircraft to Boeing without a bid for tender. All of our elected officials in Quebec have criticized this deliberate choice to push aside our aerospace industry. And this is not just depriving the industry of a $9 billion contract. Ottawa is also hurting sales of Quebec aircraft abroad by turning up its nose at our aerospace sector in front of all of our trade partners. This is not a great sales strategy. Do the Liberals realize that they're hurting our aerospace industry throughout the world? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague said, developing our aerospace industry is something we will be able to do even more with this morning's announcement. And we will also be giving the armed forces the tools they need to protect us here in Canada and to defend Canada's interest abroad. That is why businesses like CAE and others in Montreal, Mirabel, and elsewhere in Canada will be able to benefit from the various benefits from this morning's announcement. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, let's be serious. This is abandoning our aerospace industry, giving $9 billion to Boeing without a bid for tender. The Liberals are abandoning our biggest export sector, and they're not just abandoning our large businesses, they also haven't helped SMEs who may end up going bankrupt if nothing is done about paying back the money from the emergency fund. That's the Liberal record. Recently, they've hurt big companies in Quebec and small companies. I would say that ultimately they're hurting the entire economy of Quebec. The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Helping Quebec's industry and helping the aerospace industry throughout Canada was one of the goals of today's announcement. Over the next few months, we will see that there will be 3,000 jobs. There will be all sorts of benefits in Canada, including Quebec, with about $400 million a year, and that will further help our workers in the aerospace industry in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada.
The Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes.
Speaker, this morning the Chiefs of Ontario joined the chorus of Canadians decrying the failure of the Liberal carbon tax. This burden inflicted upon First Nations, allegedly the most important relationship for this Prime Minister, has forced 133 chiefs to take the government to court in order to get relief. It's clear Indigenous communities are not better off after 8 long years of this government, nor is more money being put back in the pockets of the people who pay this tax. After yet another failure, Speaker, will the Prime Minister realize that the carbon tax has failed Indigenous peoples and finally axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, this summer we saw a record wildfire season raging across the country, and I, as Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, worked with First Nations leaders all across the country as they did the most unmanageable to protect their communities. Evacuations, Mr. Speaker, people displaced for weeks, if not months, Mr. Speaker, land and property and infrastructure destroyed. We'll continue to work on fighting climate change and protecting people as we see this astronomical threat bearing down, and I look forward to doing that with First Nations leaders.
The Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Actually, the Auditor General had a plan for that. It was approved, the 112 infrastructure projects sitting on that minister's desk that would deal with the effects of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. In fact, it was Indigenous projects that talked about dikes, dams, and culverts, things that would give Indigenous communities the fighting chance to stay on their land in the event of an extreme weather event. But this minister would rather waste money. Instead of investing $6 to save those $1 to save $6, rather than the current plan of evacuation, relocation, and rebuilding. When will this minister get serious about helping Indigenous communities? Listen to the Chiefs of Ontario. Axe the tax.
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Speaker, it's too bad that the former leader of the opposition didn't listen to the Chiefs of Ontario for over a decade as the infrastructure gap grew and grew and grew, as children suffered with discriminatory First Nations child welfare, as education rates and levels were underfunded per capita.
I'm having trouble once again listening to the honourable member. There have been a number of voices close to the speaker. I'm going to ask the honourable minister, please, to start again because I would like to hear the answer.
Mr. Speaker, you have to ask yourself, how did that infrastructure gap get so big? And it was a decade of neglect. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition on the day of the apology of Prime Minister Harper said that what people really needed to do was actually get to work and show work values. These are the kinds of ethics that these Conservatives hold in terms of First Nations. We'll continue to work with First Nations on rights in respectful ways, in closing gaps, Mr. Speaker. That's what responsible governments do.
I'm going to ask all members once again to please listen to their whips as they're trying to give signs for folks to keep it together. The Honourable Député de Chicoutimi.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, once again yesterday, we saw that this Liberal Bloc coalition is not worth the cost. The Bloc joined the Liberals, as usual, to reject our motion to ask the Senate to adopt our common sense bill, C-234, to exempt farmers from the carbon tax. After 8 years, with food banks struggling, these two parties want to increase the tax even more radically. Will the Prime Minister tell his own appointed senators to stop blocking C-234? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Conservative senators ought to say to Conservative MPs is that the price on pollution reduces pollution, it puts more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 families, and it creates the jobs we need for the economy of the future. We all know that the official policy of the Conservative elite is that climate change doesn't exist, but this is 2023, and we're counting on Conservative senators and MPs to review that position.
The Honourable Member from Don Valley East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a proud Canadian. I'm proud of this nation's bilingualism, and I'm proud of the federal government's role in promoting both official languages. In the House of Commons, it is a privilege for me to hear both official languages being used. Therefore, I was both shocked and disappointed at the Canadian Heritage Committee this morning when a Conservative MP asked a Francophone minister from Quebec to answer her question in English. Could the Minister of Canadian Heritage tell this House about the long-standing importance of the official language use in this government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a proud Quebecer, a proud Francophone. I'm very proud to be able to speak French, and I would like to remind us all that we have the right to express our opinions in the language of our choice, no matter what the language the question was asked in. I was very pleased to be able to speak about the agreement with Google, but unfortunately a member of the Conservative caucus used that opportunity to question my right to express myself in my mother tongue. We are the first government to have recognized the decline of French. Bilingualism is a fundamental principle of our country. We will continue to defend and promote it, despite the fact that the Conservatives don't seem to like that.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
The Prime
Minister said that he would drop $15 billion on Stellantis to create new jobs. What he didn't say is that those jobs wouldn't be located in Windsor, in Ontario, or even in Canada. He's shipping taxpayer money to a Dutch company that's going to employ Korean foreign workers. Another slap in the face to hardworking Canadians who are struggling after 8 years of this government. They can't get their story straight on how many foreign jobs this $15 billion is buying. So why not release the contracts for Canadians to see for themselves?
Common sense.
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
I'm afraid I'll have to say we'll take no lessons from a party for the leader. When he was employment minister, Mr. Speaker, imagine not that he oversaw the loss of 3,000, not the loss of 30,000, the loss of 300,000 manufacturing jobs in this country, Mr. Speaker. And this man would like to tell us what to do, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know better. We'll continue to invest in Windsor. We'll invest in the auto sector. We'll invest in our workers. We'll invest in a prosperous Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, he should take some lessons from this side. The story changes every single time he is asked. He should admit that Canadians got robbed blind with this deal. The Prime Minister even told his backbench to keep this all a secret and talk out the clock so they don't have to release documents. There's no reason to do that unless they're hiding something. Yes. So we want to know what's in this deal, why he spent $15 billion to ship Canadian jobs overseas and pretend that after 8 years they care about labor in this country. Why so secret? What are they hiding?
Hey! Good job. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, 2,500 workers in Windsor building batteries. Canadian, local, unionized. An additional 2,300 construction jobs. Canadian, local. That message was delivered in Parliament Hill yesterday by Dave Cassidy, the president of Unifor Local 444. He represents 5,000 Stellantis workers. He will represent the 2,500 Windsor workers that will build the batteries. Who do you trust, Mr. Speaker? The guy who spent his whole life fighting for workers, or the guy who spent his whole life, his whole political career, fighting workers?
The Honourable Member from Montmagny-Lilley, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are learning that the Northvolt battery factory in Quebec will be using hundreds of foreign replacement workers. That's $7 billion in taxpayer money, which will be used to fund jobs that should belong to Quebecers. Once again, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. After 8 years in power, this Prime Minister is failing to protect Quebecers' jobs. He should make the contracts public. He should make them public. I'm just going to put on my glasses here. He needs to make these contracts public for the battery factories. When will he do that? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that my colleague put his glasses on, because I think he should start writing down some of the numbers here. The Conservative Party is never in favor of investing in the battery industry. They were against the GM investment. They were against Ford. They were against the Volkswagen investment. And now they're against Stellantis investment, which is going to create 2,500 jobs at the factory and up to 2,300 to build the factory, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely scandalous. Canadians can clearly see what side the Conservatives are on, and it's clearly not on workers' side.
Member from Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the loss of innocent lives in the Middle East as a result of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has been tragic. There is an increasingly dire need to ensure aid gets into Gaza, where civilians are suffering. Canadians want to know how the government is helping bring relief to the region. Can the Minister of International Development please update the House and Canadians what our government is doing to provide help to those desperately in need?
The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. Canada was the first Western government to take action by providing $60 million in aid for civilians affected by the conflict in Gaza. This included a matching fund that brought in 12 Canadian humanitarian organizations, and I'm pleased to share with this House that Canadians from coast to coast donated almost $14 million to this campaign. and we will double this amount to nearly $28 million. This funding will go to provide much-needed water, food, and medicines to all civilians affected by this conflict. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-Patry. Mr. Speaker, Quebec is known worldwide for its aerospace expertise. We have the skills and the workforce, and yet when we need new aircraft, the Liberals are deciding to use an American company, and for outdated aircraft, on top of everything else. Why not have an open and transparent bid for tender, which would enable companies like Bombardier to bid? This is mismanagement of public funds. We're talking about well-paid union jobs that are being ultimately lost to Quebec. Why aren't the Liberals helping our aerospace industry? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank our colleague for giving me a chance to talk a little more about this subject. This morning's news is excellent news for the armed forces, who will have aircraft that are designed for the critical situation we're now facing globally. This is also good news for the aerospace industry throughout the country. We know that providers will be receiving investments of $400 million a year with hundreds of jobs, and we know that various companies like CAE and our partnerships with Polytechnique and the Université de Sherbrooke will benefit a great many stakeholders throughout the country.
No point of order for question period. There's one more question on the list.
The Honourable Member for Richmond North Basca. Mr. Speaker, in this House, we often criticize the government vigorously, but we should also congratulate it when it does good things. I'd like to thank the Minister for her hard work to sign this first agreement with a web giant, Google. This will help our media, but I'd like to ask her to confirm that some measures have been taken to support our local and regional media. For example, in my riding, there are various small newspapers and radio stations. So I'd like to hear from her whether measures or guidelines have been put in place to ensure that these local media can also have their fair share and that this will support them in future. The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague. I recall when I was at the National Federation of Culture and I would come here to discuss the importance of protecting our media, my colleague, even though he was part of the Conservative caucus at the time, always spoke up for media, including rural media. So I'm pleased to be able to tell him that under the agreement, there will be a place for local and regional media at the negotiation table, as well as official language minority media. That will be good for all media in the country, and we're really keeping a spot at the table for local and regional media. Thank you.
As I've already said to the members yesterday, there are 4 points of order in the House. The first was done by the member for La Prairie and is coming up now. Mr. Speaker, parties were consulted, and I believe that we have unanimous consent for the following motion. That the House recall that Christmas is a tradition celebrated in Quebec and Canada. B, denounce the Canadian Human Rights Commission statement that statutory holidays related to Christianity, including Christmas and Easter, represent an obvious example of systemic religious discrimination. And my sound cut out. And C, denounce all attempts to polarize Colleagues, there was a problem with the microphones. I would ask the member for La Prairie to repeat his motion, please. Should I restart from the start? Yes. Mr. Speaker, the parties have been consulted. I think you'll see that there was unanimous consent for the following motion. That the House, A, recall that Christmas is a tradition celebrated in Quebec and Canada. B, denounce the Canadian Human Rights Commission statement that statutory holidays related to Christianity, including Christmas and Easter, represent an obvious example of systemic religious discrimination. And and that this discrimination against religious minorities in Canada is grounded in Canada's history of colonialism. C, denounce all attempts to polarize events that have been part of Quebec and Canadian heritage for generations. And D, invite all Quebecers and Canadians to unite as we approach the Christmas season. Thank you. For all those opposed to the motion, say nay. Okay. The House has heard the motion. All those opposed, say no. Adopted. A point of order. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
I believe you, if you seek, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, that the House of Commons condemn the divisive statements published by the Canadian Human Rights Commission claiming that public celebrations of Christmas amount to religious intolerance and discrimination, and the House recognize the rich cultural traditions that Christians and many other Canadians share at this special time with their friends, their communities, and their families, and affirm their right to celebrate freely, and that the House of Commons wishes all Canadians a Merry Christmas. Thank you.
I believe we don't have unanimous consent for this motion. All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. There is no unanimous consent for this motion.
The Honourable Member for Pointe-de-L'Île. Mr. Speaker, I do hope that you'll see that there is unanimous consent for the following motion. That this House remind the House that English and French are the two official languages of this Parliament. That the House remind the members that witnesses appearing at committees can testify in the official language of their choice. See that denounce the statements of the member for Lethbridge against speaking out in French during committee. For all those opposed to what the honourable member has said during his motions, please say no. So be it. The House has heard the motion. All those opposed, say nay. Unfortunately, there is not unanimous consent. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the House Government Leader.
It's very clear within our standing orders, and has been a long tradition, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, that for 15 minutes of every day the House sits, we have Standing Order 31, which enables members to be able to speak for 1 minute on the issue in which they feel that is most fitting for them on that particular day. The member from Brampton Centre, not once or twice, but on 5 occasions was not able to get his statement across, Mr. Speaker. I have never witnessed that in my experience here in the House of Commons for well over 10 years now, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it took the member 15 minutes later on another SO to be able to get his full 1-minute presentation, Madam Speaker. And even as I speak, the member across the way said that it was full of lies. Mr. Speaker, that's the type of lack of respect that I want to make reference to in terms of the point of order. Right. The member from Perth, Wellington, Nader, in fact, heckled across the street. Perth, Wellington. Oh, I'm sorry. Perth, Wellington. Perth, Wellington, Mr. Speaker, clearly indicated that, Mr. Speaker, you were a joke. Yeah, that is what the member